So before we actually jump into any ab training, I think it's important to go over what the rectus abdominis or the six-pack muscles actually do so we can get the most out of these movements that are often butchered. The rectus abdominis is in charge of flexing the spine, and that looks something like this, essentially rounding the back, bringing your rib cage closer to your pelvis. And those are going to be the 2 points that we're going to be talking about quite a bit depending on whatever ab movement we're doing. And so you're bringing your rib cage here closer to your pelvis, you're decreasing the space between those 2 points. Now you can do that in two directions. You can bring your rib cage down closer to your pelvis, or you could do the reverse in something like a Garhammer like we're going to go through today. But it's important to remember that we are talking about spinal flexion and spinal extension, right? And so we want that extension through the spine in order to lengthen the muscles, and we want that flexion through the spine, bringing the rib cage and the pelvis closer together in order to contract those muscles. What we don't want to be doing is flexing through the hip and extending through the hip. This is not lengthening or contracting our rectus abdominis, our ab muscles at all. We want to be thinking about bringing our rib cage closer to the pelvis, or in the case of the Garhammer, bringing the pelvis closer to the rib cage. And so with the Garhammer, Callie's killing me. With the Garhammer, we're actually going to be working on bringing our pelvis closer to our rib cage. I'm going to demonstrate a few reps and then we'll talk about it. So as you can see, I'm thinking about bringing my pelvis up closer to my rib cage. I'm using my knees tapping my elbows just as an objective end to the range of motion, but this movement has nothing to do with my knees at all, has nothing to do with my elbows. I'm just using that to signify the end of the rep. And so what you want to do is you want to lay down on a flat bench, we'll talk about an incline in a second, and hold your hands at the end of the bench and hug your elbows together just a little bit. Feet are going to start at the end of the bench here, and then you are going to think not about necessarily knee to elbow, but pelvis to rib cage. And so I'm thinking about bringing my pelvis up into my rib cage nice and slowly until, yeah, sure, elbows touching the knees is just fine. And then I'm going to be unraveling nice and slow. The terminology that's often used is one vertebra at a time, which just means very gently extending on the way down and flexing up one vertebra at the time on the way up. Now, it's important to make sure you're controlling both directions, especially the eccentric on the way down. That's where a lot of the work is going to be done on this movement, is controlling yourself on the way down, not flopping out of this movement. And when it comes to the concentric phase, we don't want to be flinging ourselves up. And so if you were going to mess those two up, it would look like this, where you're flinging yourself up like this and just letting yourself down. I can do this all day long. This isn't doing shit. I want nice and control. I want to be thinking about bringing the pelvis up into the rib cage, one vertebra at a time, and nice and slow on the way down. Now, when it comes to progressively overloading or making this harder over time, you have three options in order to do so. Number one is to increase the repetitions that you're doing. If you're doing something like 5, 6, 7, 8 reps, getting that up to 15 to 20 reps is an amazing way to progressively overload. The second way to make this harder is to make the bench up on an incline. Now, I don't recommend just picking this up like this, although you could try that and see how it goes. I actually recommend putting a pair of bumper plates or one large bumper plate or a stepper or something like that, and actually putting the entire bench on an incline like this, which will make it significantly harder as you're going through the movement, but at the end of the day, the movement is just the same. And the last way to make this harder is to just go slower on the way down. This isn't a race. I don't need you doing 50 reps. You want to treat the abs like every other muscle. We want to take them close to failure, somewhere between 5 and 30 reps, and make sure you're controlling the movement, not using a ton of momentum. So after you've mastered this on a flat bench and you're doing something like maybe 10 to 15 reps, which I promise is incredibly hard if you are using nice and controlled momentum in both directions, You can start to elevate the bench and challenge yourself that way.